Welcome to 28storms.com on this Friday afternoon, September 2nd. The National Hurricane Center recently upgraded Tropical Depression 13 to Tropical Storm Lee. Maximum sustained winds have increased to 40 miles per hour. It's drifting off toward the northwest at 2 miles per hour, and the lowest pressure indicated by the reconnaissance flight was down to 1,003 millibars. So the system is gradually beginning to intensify, but at a very slow rate, and the storm is expected to make landfall along the lower Louisiana coast at around 7 a.m. Sunday morning, but we have tropical storm warnings in effect from the Texas-Louisiana line all the way to Pascagoula, Mississippi, near the Alabama state line. The latest model data is still in very strong agreement with one another, with taking the system ever so gradually towards southeast Louisiana and the New Orleans metropolitan area. In fact, the storm is expected to only drift around the Louisiana coast throughout the better half of this weekend, and then begin to gradually shift more toward the northeast into southern Mississippi and southern and central Alabama. As a result of the very slow rate of speed, the storm is expected to dump copious amounts of rainfall in excess of about 10 to 20 inches, especially around southeast Louisiana and southern Mississippi. Much of Louisiana is now under a state of emergency, along with 7 counties along the coastal communities of Mississippi, and the flood threat will continue eastward into Alabama, where there are already flood watches for the Mobile weather forecast area, and of course we have the threat of even severe flooding, or at least some isolated street flooding across central Alabama, where the Hydrometeorological Prediction Center is forecasting in upwards of about 6 inches of rainfall over the next 5 days. This afternoon's visible imagery indicates that the surface circulation has become much more vigorous over the last 24 hours. However, the center of circulation is still ever so gradually off toward the west of all of the primary convection, and I overlaid the Hurricane Center forecast track just so that you can get an idea as to where that center currently is located. And once again, if we look at the latest infrared imagery, notice all of the strongest convection is displaced well to the east of the center, and if this were to remain this way for the next 48 hours, as this storm moves inland, you can expect much of the highest precipitation totals, along with the strongest winds, to be more so over the eastern portions of the Louisiana coast and possibly as far east as coastal Mississippi. Now, the reason why this is occurring is because if we go ahead and look at the latest water vapor image, we still have this persistent mid to upper level disturbance located just to the southeast of Galveston, Texas, and that is still causing a lot of westerly shear and a lot of dry air being pumped in from Texas, and so therefore the storm is very lopsided. However, the wind shear values are gradually beginning to decrease over the storm, so we still expect there to be some intensification up until landfall. The latest SIMS wind shear analysis still shows the westerly shear quite well, as we see streaming here from the coastal portions of Texas, and the latest color representation is indicating, however, that the upper level winds are becoming a little bit more favorable with time. These dashed blue colors denote that the shear has decreased in excess of about 5 to 10 knots over the last 24 hours, so therefore the upper level ridging is gradually trying to build in. And if we go ahead and take a look at some of the raw text model output from the ship's intensity model, if we focus our attention on the shear row, it's showing that we're going to have about 13 to 17 knots of shear within the next 6 hours. However, as we go into the 24-hour period, notice right here the model is forecasting the shear to decrease below 5 knots. So if this storm is going to make any run whatsoever at becoming a minimal hurricane, we could begin to see more signs of this sometime tomorrow afternoon. However, based on the latest water vapor animation, I would still feel inclined to believe that this will remain as a strong tropical storm as it comes inland, and that is in very good agreement with the latest Hurricane Center intensity forecast. We also have pretty good model agreement that this will remain below a Category 1. As we can see, all of the models are indicating this, except for the ship model, and this version of the ship model does not take land interaction into account, and our Tropical Storm Lee is more than likely going to be inland by the time we get into the 60 to 72 hour time frame. But as we've been saying all along, this is going to be a primary flood threat, especially for southeast Louisiana and southern Mississippi. This is the latest radar animation out of Slidell, Louisiana. We already have some pretty moderate bands beginning to affect the coastal parishes, and if we go ahead and turn on the latest storm totals, we see that in excess of about 2 to 3 inches have already fallen here along coastal Louisiana and especially Plaquemines Parish. We are now going to take a quick look at the 12Z GFS forecast, and this is the current location of our tropical cyclone. It does have the vorticity max at the 500 millibar, displaced a little bit more toward the northeast, which is somewhat understandable given the southwest shear in place. And as we go into the next 24 hours, notice that the storm is really not expected to move much at all, which makes sense because the storm is currently stationary, with the steering currents remaining weak over the next 24 hours. So then as we progress into early Sunday morning, the storm is finally beginning to work its way into southern Louisiana, and then eventually into 72 hours. Notice that the storm still has not made much forward progress. If anything, it's beginning to make a turn more toward the northeast into the lower half of Mississippi. So the main flood risk will be over southern Alabama, southern Mississippi, and especially southeast Louisiana. And then with time, this whole entire system is going to begin moving more toward the northeast. And we could also make out that the trough is deepening it just a little bit more, and that's going to be the main steering factor that is going to pull this storm northward in the first place. Now, given that track, these are the latest 5-day precipitation forecast totals from the GFS, and it's actually dumping the most rainfall over Plaquemines Parish, St. Bernard Parish, and the Mississippi Sound. And we could even see some locally higher totals if we begin to see one band training over one location for a prolonged period of time. And finally, we're going to take one quick look at the 12Z ECMWF model run. There's our tropical storm Lee located just to the south of Louisiana at the current time. As we go into 24 hours, the storm is beginning to move a little bit more toward the north, and for whatever reason, the European is continuing to intensify this into a minimal borderline Category 1 hurricane right before landfall. Perhaps it is weakening the shear just like the ship's model, and in turn the storm is really beginning to intensify here a little bit more on the European compared to any other model. But fortunately, by 48 hours, the storm is expected to begin moving, or at least cross the coast of Louisiana, so that should begin to restrict the development potential here. And then as we go into 72 hours, notice that we're still dealing with a very slow-moving storm. This is the Monday morning forecast, and this would be very problematic for some of the low-lying coastal communities, for example Grand Isle, and all interests around Plaquemines Parish, because we would still have a constant onshore flow, and the European taken verbatim would indicate that this would be a minimal Category 1. By Tuesday morning, the storm is finally beginning to pull away from southeast Louisiana, but it goes directly over southern Mississippi and southern Alabama, so you guys are still definitely in the mix for at least some type of flood potential. And then even by day 5, the storm is not moving away all that quickly. In fact, it just looks like it's going to wash itself out directly over central Alabama on this run. So although we're not expecting rainfall totals nearly as high up here between Montgomery and Birmingham, there could still be some risk of isolated street flooding, and as indicated by the HPC 5-day forecast, you could still get in excess of about 6 to 7 inches of rainfall up there. So that wraps up your Tropical Storm Lee update for this Friday afternoon. Stick with 28storms.com and the Hurricane Tracker app throughout the duration of this particular storm's landfall.